Outpost Solera was burning. Ash filtered through the fractured dome like black snow settling on twisted beams, shattered walkways, and the exposed nerve endings of what was once a bustling frontier colony. Kael Riven moved through the wreckage with practiced stealth, the matte surface of his stellar vanguard armor blending into the flickering gloom. His pulse rifle was warm from recent use, and the visor overlay in his helmet flashed warnings in red power grid offline. Life support critical. No signals from command. The Crothan Blitz had come without warning. Plasma artillery tearing through the city's shielded perimeter like parchment, their ground troops following in brutal waves. The last orders Kael received before the comms died were simple. Hold the inner corridor until evac was complete. That had been 3 hours ago. Now he was alone, or so he thought. He ducked beneath a collapsed ferrosteel girder boots, crunching over scorched ceramic tile. When he heard it, a faint rhythmic gasp, too organic to be wind, too erratic to be machinery. He turned, raising his rifle instinctively. Heat signatures bloomed on his HUD. There, beneath a cracked support beam, lodged against the far wall, barely shielded by fallen banners of the Solari crest, something moved. Kael approached cautiously, stepping over charred debris. His rifle lowered almost without thought when he saw her. She was Solari. Even without the war paint or full ceremonial armor, the crimson skin, lithe frame, and cascading silver hair marked her unmistakably. Her eyes were closed, face streaked with blood and soot. A thin film of glowing fluid coated a gash along her ribcage, Solari healing serum weak and nearly depleted. He almost didn't recognize her at first, but then she stirred, and Kael saw the faint shimmer of the violet marking along her temple, the royal insignia. Serenthalor, highborn, unreachable, untouchable, at least according to every diplomatic file he'd ever skimmed. She opened her eyes. They locked eyes, his blue against her glowing violet. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she tried to push herself upright, gritting her teeth against the pain. He moved to steady her, but she recoiled slightly, eyes narrowing. Human, she rasped, her voice shredded but unmistakably commanding. "Why are you here?" Kael should have reported her immediately. Protocol was clear. Solari survivors were to be escorted directly to Celestial Conquered custody, not assisted solo, especially not royalty. But instead, he crouched beside her, ignoring the sting of his own shoulder wound. "You're bleeding out," he said simply. "I'm aware. You'll be dead in 10 minutes. That is also likely." Something in her tone caught him off guard. Not defiance, not fear, but resignation. His gaze dropped to the debris pinning her legs. If the plasma burns hadn't already cooked her tendons, the pressure was certainly cutting off circulation. Her hand trembled as she tried to activate a nearby beacon. The device sparked uselessly. Her breaths were shortening. Kael holstered his rifle. "I'm getting you out," he said. She blinked. Why? There was no diplomatic win in this. No medal, no extraction team. But Kael just shook his head and said, "Because no one deserves to die alone in this hellscape. Not even you." She stared at him for a long second, the strange little smile flickering at the corner of her mouth barely visible. Then she passed out. Kael exhaled sharply, wedged his shoulder beneath the beam and screamed as he lifted. It budged, just enough. He dragged her free, ignoring the burn of tearing muscle. Her skin, even through the thin layers of armor, was warmer than his, radiating a kind of inner heat. Her hair, when it brushed his forearm, smelled faintly of ozone and crushed herbs. He adjusted his hold, slinging her gently across his shoulders in a fireman's carry. Her pulse fluttered beneath his glove. She was still alive. The Crothans would circle back soon. Kael didn't know where the nearest friendly lines were, but he remembered spotting an abandoned maintenance tunnel back 2 blocks old Solari design, possibly predating the main colony. If it hadn't collapsed, it might just get them both out. He moved quickly through the crumbling alleyways, feeling each footstep through the soles of his boots. Seren stirred once, murmuring something in her native tongue. Liquid syllables he didn't understand, but her voice pressed against his ear like a ghost of a breath. They made it to the tunnel. The entrance was half sealed by rubble, but he squeezed through, dragging her behind him. Darkness swallowed them. The HUD dimmed, automatically switching to night vision. Moisture dripped from the pipes overhead. Somewhere deeper in the dark, a bioluminescent pulse flickered in irregular rhythm, likely reactor residue. Kael laid her gently on the floor, tearing off a sleeve of his undersuit to bind her side. She winced but didn't wake. As he worked, something strange pulsed on her chest just beneath the armor plate. He pulled the clasp aside and found a shimmering metal crest engraved with the Solari word for honor. It was stained with her blood. Kale hesitated, then unclipped it and pressed it against her palm. "You're not dying today, princess," he said softly. He sat beside her as her breathing steadied, rifle cradled across his lap tunnel, breathing around them like the lungs of the world itself. Above, the war raged on. But in that abandoned vein beneath the city, something ancient and quiet had begun to form. A promise, wordless maybe, but real. The deeper levels of the tunnel system hadn't seen footfall in decades. Faint lines of Siluri script shimmered faintly along the curved walls, warning runes, Kale guessed, or maintenance instructions. The language remained largely untranslatable to most human systems, but its symmetry fascinated him. He moved carefully through the half-lit passages, Seren still unconscious in his arms. The air was thick with damp mineral scents and the occasional whiff of burnt circuitry. Somewhere far behind them, the Crothan patrols would be sweeping the upper levels. He needed to keep moving. After what felt like hours navigating twists and forgotten corridors, he found a partially collapsed chamber with a secure overhead vent. The space was defensible, low-entrance blind corners. Kael laid Seren down gently atop a broken control panel, her breathing still shallow but even. He pulled off his helmet and set it beside him. For a moment, he just sat in the stillness, listening to the quiet hum of forgotten power lines buried in the walls. Then Seren stirred. Her hand reached reflexively toward her side, and her eyes fluttered open. She winced, trying to sit up. Kael leaned forward. "Easy, you lost a lot of blood." She blinked at him, then looked around the chamber. "We're underground. Old infrastructure," he nodded. "Pre-expansion era by the look of it. You Solari build things to last." She didn't respond immediately. Her gaze moved back to him, studying his face now in a way she hadn't had the strength to do before. "You stayed," she said. Kael shrugged. "Wasn't really an option to leave." "There's always an option," Seren replied quietly. He didn't argue. He handed her a water pack from his belt, and she drank cautiously. When she finished, she looked down at the stained fabric around her wound. "You used your uniform. Didn't exactly have a Solari medkit lying around." Something flickered in her expression. Part amusement, part something gentler. "I thought humans weren't sentimental," she said after a pause. "Your species is known for pragmatism and loud music." Kael grinned. "We contain multitudes, and some of us like soft jazz." "Jazz? Never mind," he chuckled. For a while, neither of them spoke. The air felt heavy but not uncomfortable. Kael busied himself with recalibrating his rifle's sighting systems. Seren watched him in silence before finally breaking it. "You're not like the others." "Which others?" "Commanders, soldiers, humans in general." "Well, I brush my teeth and don't shoot civilians. That puts me ahead of at least half." Her lips curled into something dangerously close to a smile. Kael glanced at her, then dug into his field bag, pulling out a protein bar. "You eat?" She took it, peeled the wrapping, and sniffed it skeptically before taking a bite. "Salty," she said, chewing slowly. "What's in it?" "Compressed legumes and regret." She coughed slightly, almost laughing, then shook her head. "Our rations taste of moss and discipline." "Sounds like childhood trauma." Seren leaned back slightly against the console, her movements still guarded. "You're odd, Kael Riven." "I get that a lot." There was a strange ease forming between them, something unspoken, but quietly undeniable. They were still strangers, still representatives of opposing histories. But there was a growing comfort in the shared silence, and in the shared danger. Suddenly, a distant tremor shook the corridor. Dust rained from the overhead vent. Both of them stiffened, reaching for weapons instinctively. Kael stood, pressing a finger to his ear. Static, comms still down. "We need to move," he said. "I can walk," Seren insisted, already trying to stand. He reached her side before she collapsed again. Without waiting for approval, he scooped her into his arms. Her body was warm against his chest, light despite the armor. She didn't protest this time. They made their way through a narrow series of offshoot tunnels, Kael's visor sweeping for thermal signatures. The deeper they went, the older the architecture became. Strange roots had grown through the walls, glowing faintly blue with internal bioluminescence. Seren's eyes widened slightly as she noticed. "This is ancient Solari tech, pre-Exodus era." Kael glanced at her. "You recognize it?" "I've only seen sketches. No one thought any of it survived." They rounded a bend and entered a large atrium, almost cathedral-like, with towering growths of crystal arching overhead. At the center stood a hollow ovular structure made of layered metal petals pulsing with residual light. Seren whispered something in her native tongue. Kael looked around. "You think that's a shelter?" "It's a healing pod," she said, awe bleeding into her voice. But not like the med chambers you use. This is different. It regenerates cellular tissue through neural resonance. That sounds unnecessarily mysterious. It reads intention, she explained. Emotion. It doesn't work on those without a bond. Kale raised an eyebrow. We talking family, friends, life mates? Yes, she said. All of it. Physical closeness helps initiate the link. If two beings share enough resonance, the pod opens. He stepped toward it, carrying her. The metal petals reacted instantly, unfurling in slow spirals like a flower awakening after a century of sleep. Seren stared. That shouldn't be possible. Kale looked down at her. Guess your pod has a soft spot for weird humans. He stepped inside. The chamber was warm, almost humid. The interior lights pulsed to their heartbeat. As the petals closed around them, a faint hum rose like distant singing underwater. Her breath trembled against his collarbone. Then the light deepened. Threads of gold and silver drifted through the chamber like strands of silk, weaving around their limbs, syncing their pulse, scanning their minds. Kyle felt something crackle in his skull, a sudden flood of thoughts that weren't his. Memories, laughter, old Solari battle rituals. Seren's childhood, the scent of her father's armor, the sound of her mother's voice. It washed over him like a wave. She gasped, clutching his arm, their minds fused. Her memories collided with his. A back porch on Earth, his father's gruff laughter, the burn of first heartbreak, the scream of battle, and through it all, her voice. Why are you here? Because no one deserves to die alone. The chamber surged with heat. When the light faded, they were still entangled. Their bodies hadn't moved, but something fundamental had. The pod opened. Kale held Saren closer, their breathing synchronized. She looked up at him, violet eyes wide. We're linked now, she whispered, more than mentally. He didn't speak. He just nodded, brushing a strand of her silver hair from her face. For a moment, neither war nor history existed, just the echo of their hearts, resonating in a rhythm older than either species. The interior of the pod sealed around them with a hiss, silken and enveloping the barrier between flesh and machine, dissolving into a shared pulse. Kale's breath slowed instinctively, chest rising in time with the faint rhythm of Thalia's. Her presence was no longer just beside him. It was within him, blooming like a warm tide behind his ribcage. The pod's bioluminescent threads slid across their bodies, mapping their neural currents and hormone signatures, syncing signals that had never evolved to meet. And yet, they did. The synchronization began at the base of the spine, where ancient Valari biotech injected a whisper of code into Kale's nervous system. At first it was a surge, disorienting electric, but then the sensation melted into something gentler. A braided light twisting through his mind, latching onto his most instinctive centers and threading its way forward like ivy through stone. Her pain came first sharp and raw, buried beneath layers of discipline. The wound to her side, yes, but deeper still was the wound of betrayal. He felt flashes, her captured squad mates, the cold lab table, the realization that her genetic data had been bartered by her own command for temporary ceasefire. She had not only been injured, she had been offered. Then came her fear. It was not the fear of death. Valari accepted mortality with quiet reverence. It was the fear of being devoured, not metaphorically, but quite literally. In her culture, to fail to conceive after a selection meant her partner had biological rights to her flesh, to reclaim his investment in the act of creation. She had expected that fate, had awaited it. And when Kyle had lifted her in his arms instead, it had not felt like kindness, it had felt like anomaly. Through the link, he gave her something in return. Not intentionally. The pod made intention irrelevant. She saw his memories, his childhood beneath Terran sky, the weight of a rifle pressed into his 18-year-old palms, the comrades whose final breaths he had borne with white knuckles and dry eyes. She tasted the sharp flavor of guilt when he chose her over orders. She felt the way his heart stuttered when her pulse first flickered beneath his glove. And then they felt something new, a resonance, neither biological nor technological. The pod responded with an audible shift, like gears rotating beneath a stone cathedral, its luminescent vines wrapping tighter, pressing them closer as pulses of crimson and gold coursed across its surface. The healing had begun, but the process was not merely restoration. It was integration. Their breathing aligned completely, heart rates matched. Chemical signatures shifted, her reproductive enzymes igniting briefly before dimming, his hormonal matrix destabilizing before evening out, forming a mirrored echo. The pod registered a temporary cellular overlap. Genetic harmonization. Nothing permanent yet. But the potential flickering on its sensors was undeniable. Outside, the station trembled again, another structural collapse above them unnoticed. Inside, the silence stretched into intimacy. Kael's hand floated toward hers, not of its own volition, but as a result of the shared impulse now anchored between them. Fingers brushed. The neural threads surged. His memories no longer played like films, now they folded into sensation. She felt the way his muscles ached after every mission, the warmth of rain against Terran metal rooftops, the heaviness in his bones when he stood at another shallow grave. He felt the way her people dreamed in fractals, geometric visions passed down in ancestral flash, the ceremonial bonds that glowed under Valari moonlight, the quiet, resigned terror of knowing her first mating might end in consumption. The pod pushed further, initiating the last stage of sync. A second layer of neural bonding activated, normally reserved for mate-pair rituals in Valari sanctuaries. It was not designed for cross-species use, and yet the systems detected compatibility, perhaps not by code, but by will. Synaptic tendrils unfolded between their temples, delicately anchoring into each cerebral cortex, transmitting pulses of biochemical data that now bore the signature of both. For a single moment, there was no Kael and no Thalia, only a shared consciousness, held in a sphere of warm light, infinite in boundary. The pod pulsed once, then receded. Their vitals normalized. The healing was complete. The link, fragile, partial, but irreversible, remained. The chamber opened with a sigh. Kael emerged first, uncertain if his limbs were truly his. The pod's interface flickered with foreign symbols, translating into two words, compatible resonance. Thalia stepped out behind him, no longer trembling, her posture slow but sure. Her skin shimmered with restored vitality, and beneath it something else glowed. A presence, a spark. Not within her mind, but somewhere deeper in her belly, perhaps, or maybe in the curve of her spine, where Kael's heartbeat still echoed. The pod had recorded a harmonic flare in the final phase. No embryo, not yet, but a seed. Genetic resonance didn't merely sync, it tested the potential for creation. And the test had passed. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. The bond was not absolute, but it was enough. Enough to fight with. Enough to kill for. Enough to die beside. The world beyond the healing pod had shifted in intangible ways, though the metallic petals of the chamber unfurled silently, revealing the cavernous structure once more. Nothing outside had truly changed, yet everything within Kael Riven and Saren Thalor had been irrevocably altered. They stepped out into the crystalline atrium, with new weight in their breath and a subtle synchronization in their movement, not born of rehearsal or training, but of something far deeper, instinctual, subconscious, and mutual. Their bodies carried the resonance of the pod, the remnants of Silary biotechnology now mingling with Kael's human physiology. The residual glow beneath his skin flickered faintly at his pulse points, threads of golden hue beneath pale flesh, while Saren's own bioluminescent markings shimmered brighter along her shoulders and temples, as though the bond had awakened dormant energy coded into her lineage. Every step was layered with awareness. He no longer needed to glance at her to sense her position. Her balance guided his. His urgency tempered hers. And within their chests, the synchronized rhythm of hearts beat not in unison, but in harmony, individual melodies interlaced into a song that had never existed before. Deeper into the lower tunnels of Eloria they moved with purpose. The environment responded differently now. Bioreactive vines withdrew from their approach. Lattice glass panels flickered to life, revealing schematic interfaces neither of them had seen before. The planet itself, or rather the deeper intelligence once embedded in its pre-Exodus systems, was awakening to their shared presence. The ancient infrastructure wasn't just noticing them, it was allowing them access. Beyond a sealed doorway, a corridor flickered open, lights cascading in a ripple as if the path was being revealed one step at a time. Along the walls, geometric etchings pulsed with shifting hues, highlighting vital systems, power cores, subroutines, defense grid controls. At the far end stood a circular dais, with a dual console interface. Dual authorization required. Biological compatibility mandated. The system had waited generations for two entities that could fulfill both. They stepped forward together, and the console welcomed them without resistance. Kyle extended a hand toward the control interface, and Seren mirrored the motion without discussion. When their palms touched the panel simultaneously, it bloomed with radiant sigils, and beneath their skin they both felt it feedback, not mechanical, but neural. Not data, but intuition. Sudden images flooded their minds. The surface of Aloria under siege, Crothan fleets repositioning along the orbit. Defensive cannons still intact, hidden in temple sectors long believed desecrated, awaiting activation. But more than that, the interface revealed dormant systems built not just to repel, but to protect and bind. Biological weapons designed not to destroy, but to unify. Shield matrices that responded to resonance between two distinct life forms. Their bond had become a key. Seren stumbled slightly from the surge of insight, and Kael steadied her without needing to look. The reaction was seamless, like breathing. A faint warmth radiated where their hands touched the console, then faded, leaving behind a sense of silent permission. The chamber dimmed again, returning to ambient light. The system had accepted them. Beyond the chamber, the ground shuddered faintly. A tremor passed through the stone. Crothan troops had breached another district. Time was fracturing. As they moved upward through back passages, known only to Solari command lines, their bond continued to strengthen. There was no formal ceremony, no spoken contract, but the biological imprint of their connection was now etched into every movement. When Kyle's foot landed on an unstable beam, Seren shifted her weight to steady him. When Seren's side flared in pain from the wound, Kyle's arm instinctively found the exact point of pressure to ease it. Their nervous systems had begun communicating faster than any language could manage. They reached the outer chambers of a forgotten transport hub. Beneath layers of collapsed foliage and scorched crystal, a dormant exolift activated in their presence. It carried them up in silence, exposed now to fractured skylight breaking through a canyon of fallen structures. Seren's hand rested briefly on her lower abdomen, subtle unconscious. The pod had done more than heal. It had seeded possibilities within her, the kind that would not be fully understood until later. Kael's gaze flickered toward her, not questioning, only sensing. No words passed. The awareness was already there, mutual and tender. The lift crested a ridge, and the old city opened before them. The skyline bore the scars of orbital fire. Towers snapped like broken spires, and the air shimmered with residual plasma distortion. But in the distance, the dormant temple district flickered to life, its shielding nodes illuminating in sequence, reacting to the subtle frequencies now carried by their bodies. The planet was responding to the bond. Kael adjusted the grip on his weapon. The rifle felt lighter now, as if it recognized his readiness, not just as a soldier, but as something more. Seren drew a blade from a collapsed shrine beside them, a relic forged from obsidian-hardened moonsteel, its edge singing at a frequency only Solari could hear. Yet Kael heard a faint hum, too, just beneath perception, like his bones remembered the sound from her memory. They moved through the Undercity, past broken battlements and shattered sky bridges. The Crothan presence thickened patrols coordinated through neural uplinks heavily armored and precise. But Kael and Seren no longer fought alone. Their movements, though silent, carried the echo of coordination forged in something deeper than training. When Kael ducked, Seren leapt. When she moved to strike, he shifted his fire to blind the enemy flank. Crothan units fell without understanding what they faced, not two opponents but a singular entity with dual bodies, a convergence of purpose honed through genetic resonance. By the time they reached the outer ring of the Temple District, the ancient planetary cannons had fully awakened. Defense systems blinked to life, turrets unfolding like the limbs of sleeping titans. But without activation from the central core, they remained idle. Seren guided them to the final gateway, a glyph-locked chamber that required not just touch, but will. They approached, breath caught in the edge of readiness. As they pressed their hands to the final lock, light burst from the gate, bathing them in searing brilliance. The gate did not open, it acknowledged. The chamber within responded to more than their bodies. It acknowledged their union. A pulse surged into orbit. High above the planet, ancient satellites reoriented. A signal went out. And for the first time in centuries, Eloria's ancient weapons aligned not to destroy, but to shield. Behind them, Crothan forces began to retreat, scrambling against an enemy that had awakened something buried too deep for their scans to detect. Seren and Kael stood at the nexus point of ancient technology and new biology. The bond forged in secrecy had become a planetary defense system. But the war wasn't over. The Crothans would retaliate with force. And something in the wind, a biological whisper in Seren's bloodstream, hinted that the resonance they now shared had consequences far beyond either of them. The days that followed blurred into kinetic momentum. The city of Solara, once thought lost to Crothan fire, had become the epicenter of unexpected resistance. From the sky, the orbiting fleet saw only chaos and flame. But within the planetary crust beneath the veils of destruction, a new force stirred, precise, adaptive, and unrelenting. Kael Riven and Seren Thalor no longer moved as two. Their bodies operated in tandem, not through rehearsed choreography or command signals, but through shared awareness. The bond forged in the ancient healing chamber had evolved beyond emotional or mental resonance. It had become functional, tactical, tangible on the battlefield. Every breath was aligned. Every heartbeat fell into rhythm. When Kael raised his plasma rifle, Seren was already flanking his target. When she drew her moonsteel blade, his eyes traced the opening in enemy formation before her first step. Together they moved like fluid, an organic algorithm pulsing through the broken architecture of Eloria. As the Crothans surged through the temple district, deploying heavy infantry and neural disruptors, Kael and Seren launched countermeasures with elegant brutality. Serene's blade shimmered through low-light combat fields, her strikes unerringly precise. Kael's weapon systems calibrated mid-combat, adapting aim and energy output based on inputs he didn't consciously register, information streamed directly from their shared nervous link. Enemy units faltered. Surveillance drones recorded patterns they could not decrypt, two figures moving with impossible unity, as if directed by one mind. Defense systems once dormant responded to their presence. Arc pylons that hadn't fired in centuries discharged coordinated bursts along enemy flanks, guided by Seren's instinct and Kael's battlefield analysis. The pair became legend before the final assault began. Behind the tactical gains lay something deeper, unseen, yet unmistakable. The residual effect of their biological convergence extended beyond motor synchronization. Kael's metabolism had shifted subtly. His immune system had begun processing foreign proteins as familiar. Seren's neurochemical output adjusted to match stress markers detected in Kael's physiology. Shared adrenaline, shared serotonin surges, shared fatigue, but also shared intuition. Their thoughts weren't vocalized. They didn't need to be. In a moment of calm between offensives, Kael felt a pulse, not from outside, but from within. A warmth in his core that didn't belong to him alone. Seren turned to him before he could ask the question, her gaze already carrying the answer. Beneath her palm, resting instinctively against her abdomen, a subtle glow radiated beneath her armor. The pod had not simply healed. It had altered. Their bond was no longer just spiritual or neural, it was genetic. No words passed between them. None were needed. The awareness settled between them like gravity, heavier than steel, more sacred than oath. But the revelation gave rise to urgency. The Crothan forces, detecting the activation of ancient systems, began deploying countermeasures. Their flagships descended into lower orbit, casting long shadows across burning plateaus. Atmospheric disturbances signaled that a final strike was imminent. Kael and Seren, acting without pause, descended toward the planetary core relay, an interface chamber built into the heart of the oldest temple. Within lay the Starlance, a weapon system older than either species, capable of delivering kinetic plasma at orbital range. It required dual authentication, not through key codes or voice command, but through harmony. As they entered the temple's final chamber, stone statues of forgotten warrior priests loomed over them. Glyphs pulsed faintly, recognizing Seren's lineage and Kael's attunement. The air vibrated with ancestral energy, not angry but expectant. They stepped onto twin pressure plates. Runes ignited beneath their boots. A pillar of light enveloped them both, scanning not just DNA but intention. The system asked no questions. It only required alignment. Their pulse synchronized. Memories surged across their bond, Kael's boyhood training under a fractured Earth sky. Seren's first rite of passage beneath violet moons. The healing pod's warmth. The sound of one another's breathing in the dark. The Starlance activated. Far above in the stratosphere, Crothan command vessels began evasive maneuvers. Too late. The weapon discharged. A column of radiant energy erupted from the temple's peak, splitting clouds and atmospheric shielding in a single breath. The blast lanced upward in silence, light swallowing the void between ground and orbit. Crothan hulls cracked, flagships listed, their comms fell to static. Celestial conquered satellites, long silent, reawakened to the energy signature. Within minutes, human command vessels responded, triangulating fire on retreating Crothan escape pods. The tide of battle shifted in a cascade. Yet Kael and Seren remained at the core. The Starlance had done more than destroy. It had signaled something ancient and immutable, that the Guardians of Aeloria had returned. And they were not purely human, nor entirely Solari, but something new. As the temple chamber dimmed, Seren leaned against the stone breath, shallow but steady. Kael stood beside her, the hum of the weapon still vibrating in his bones. The glow beneath her armor pulsed gently again. Their bond was not a metaphor. It had become life. Outside reports poured in retreating Crothan battalions, damaged fleets, orbital silence. The war was not yet over, but a decisive blow had been struck. Yet neither of them moved. In the quiet that followed, their shared awareness bent inward. The link between them, initially forged by necessity, now pulsed with something far more enduring. Trust had become instinct. Connection had become purpose. And within the fusion of human will and Silari grace, something unprecedented had taken root, not just a child, but a new symbol for two civilizations once fractured by fear. They would fight again, no doubt. The galaxy remained fractured alliances tenuous. But the path forward had changed. Kael Riven and Seren Thalor no longer stood as soldier and alien. They had become a singular force, and the world had begun to take notice. In orbit above Aeloria, the wreckage of the Crothan flagship drifted like fractured ice, jagged remnants glowing faintly against the backdrop of distant stars. The Celestial Concord's diplomatic fleet held position in defensive formation, their hulls gleaming with the neutral light of warships poised between parley and fire. The silence over the comms belied the intensity that gripped the command centers across both human and Solari factions. But on the surface, within the ancient shell of the Starlance Temple, the pulse of something older than politics beat beneath the stone. Kael Riven and Seren Thalor moved through the temple's lower sanctums like currents in the same stream. Their bond was no longer theory or novelty, it had become strategy. As they exited the central chamber, Silari guards and human commandos awaited them in the courtyard. Neither spoke. They simply stepped aside, heads bowed, not to rank, but to resonance. No chain of command dictated obedience, but all who saw them understood instinctively that these two were no longer of separate worlds. Tactical displays projected from nearby consoles, flickering with planetary maps and movement forecasts. The Crothans were regrouping at the outer arcology ruins, an attempt to stage a final stand or launch an orbital counterattack. Scans indicated they had deployed their elite guard, modified with cortical implants and neural dampeners designed to disrupt psychic interference. But those tactics had been modeled against old warfare, against lone soldiers, not bonded pairs moving in synchronized thought. Seren activated the ancient planetary relay beacons, directing planetary defense grids toward the Crothan staging zones. Kael coordinated with human forward units, relaying adjusted vectors and encryption keys drawn directly from Solari systems. What would have taken days of interspecies diplomacy passed between them in minutes, streamlined through their bond. Aeloria began to breathe again. In the heart of the control bunker, surrounded by command officers from both races, Seren outlined the strategy with calm precision. Her voice carried authority forged not only from her lineage, but from victory. Beside her, Kael's presence acted as both shield and anchor, his silence grounding the room in focus. They moved like a neural network, one thought ahead of the others, one step ahead of the enemy. The final strike began before dawn. Crothan artillery battered the edge of the Silari defense wall, attempting to fracture the shielding with concentrated plasma bursts. Human forces flanked through the subterranean canals, while Solari skyfighters soared in calculated arcs across the ridgelines. But it was Kael and Seren who delivered the fulcrum blow. They led a joint strike force through the ruins of the southern conduit, a collapse zone deemed too unstable for normal movement. But the ancient systems recognized Seren's biosignature and Kael's linked presence, guiding them through pulse-lit pathways that bent beneath their boots like living metal. The deeper they moved into Crothan-controlled territory, the more the terrain shifted, warped by enemy terraformers and filled with defense drones. But neither blinked. Their awareness had begun to manifest outwardly, not just anticipating enemy movement, but subtly altering the electromagnetic signature of the battlefield. Where Seren stepped, shielding flickered. Where Kale moved, Crothan drones hesitated, as if their target profiles couldn't compute the anomaly. At the heart of the Crothan formation, the command nexus loomed, a mobile fortress embedded into the crust, surrounded by shock troopers and energy barriers. The strike team faltered, unable to breach the shield perimeter. Kale and Seren stepped forward alone. They reached out together, palms meeting over the central fusion node, and in that instant, their bodies became conduits. The energy of the planet moved through them. Their bond, already stabilized by biological fusion, now interfaced with ancient systems and foreign technology alike. The barrier flickered, then dropped. In that moment, as the Crothan commander realized what stood before him, the tide turned. Kale's rifle didn't fire first. Seren's blade struck like lightning, bypassing armor, disabling control nodes. Kale followed with suppressive fire, moving in sync with her rhythm. The enemy didn't face two targets. They faced a phenomenon. The fight ended in seconds. Crothan units, leaderless and disoriented, were subdued or forced to retreat. The battlefield fell silent. From orbit, the Celestial Concord recorded the data. From within, the system confirmed the outcome. The war for all strategic purposes was over. But the aftermath was something else entirely. In the halls of the Celestial Concord, ambassadors from a dozen races convened under flickering lights to address the nature of what had occurred. Questions arose not just about tactics, but about what Kyle and Seren represented. A bond that crossed not only species but systems. A child gestating from such a bond, confirmed by scans and genetic telemetry. What did it mean for diplomacy, for biology, for power? Proposals flooded the channels. Some suggested formal alliances reinforced by bloodlines and technology. Others feared the implications, warning of hybrid supremacy or cultural erosion. The political storm churned, but at its center stood only two beings, warriors, whose bond had changed the course of a planetary war and given rise to a new symbol neither side had foreseen. Kale and Seren, for their part, remained unshaken. In a private chamber within the Concord's orbital station, they stood together before a panel of representatives. Questions were posed, theories debated, but neither argument nor accolade moved them. Their actions had not been for policy, they had been for each other. The final statement, delivered not as declaration, but quiet affirmation, came from Seren. Where laws might falter and treaties fray, she said the universe must learn that the strongest link is not in command or conquest, but in trust. What had begun as a rescue had become a revolution, not of governments, but of connection. The child they carried would be born not as proof of power, but of possibility. And as the chamber fell silent, as even the oldest species paused to consider the meaning of resonance, the stars beyond the viewport blinked into formation like ancient eyes opening for the first time. 5 years later, Aloria bloomed beneath twin suns. What had once been a war-torn colony veined with ruins and broken settlements had transformed into a nexus of interstellar cooperation. Towering crystalline structures stood beside human-designed alloy towers and woven gardens of bioluminescent flora intertwined with terraformed soil from Earth. The skyline reflected not just peace, but fusion. At the heart of the city, the Joint Command Center rose from the ridge where the Star Lance Temple once stood, built from a blend of Celari amberstone and reinforced Terran steel. Inside, the central council chamber echoed with decisions shaped by two voices, one carrying the cadence of Earth, and the other the quiet resonance of Aloria. Kale Riven and Seren Thalor no longer needed titles to command presence. Though Seren retained her standing as High Protector among the Celari and Kyle served as Chief Liaison to the Celestial Concord, their authority came not from appointments but from legacy. Every corridor they walked together, every signature they penned bore the weight of their shared past, the battles they'd survived, the systems they'd awakened, and the child they'd brought into the world. Rael moved like sunlight on water fluid, quick and full of laughter. His crimson skin shimmered in soft hues and his hair, silver-threaded with black, fell in wild waves around his face. He was smaller than his Celari cousins, but stronger than his human peers. His eyes, violet with flecks of blue, held the impossible depth of one born between stars. In the city's learning enclave, Rael had already become the subject of fascination. Not because he was first of his kind, though he was, but because he understood languages before they were taught, sensed emotions before they were spoken, and moved through space with awareness. his instructors could not quantify. When asked how he knew things, Rael simply replied that he could hear the quiet between people. His presence was not miracle but culmination. Seren watched him now from the balcony of their shared residence, her eyes soft despite the tactical scroll clutched in one hand. Below, Rael sprinted across the garden with other children, half human, half Silari, and even a few from distant species who had since joined the planetary enclave. His laughter rose like music, unfiltered and wild. Kael stepped beside her armor, traded for civilian attire, though the trace of a plasma scar remained visible just above his collarbone, a relic from the day he had shielded her in the plaza. He carried a cup of dark infusion brewed from Silari root leaves and earth-grown spices. Together they watched as Rael skidded to a stop, one hand outstretched to help a smaller girl to her feet. She looked up at him with wide eyes, dust on her cheeks, and said something lost to distance. He nodded solemnly and patted her shoulder, then returned to the chase. Serene's gaze drifted upward to the sky where celestial conquered patrol ships moved in tranquil orbit. No longer watchers, but partners. Change had not come easily. The political wrangling had lasted years. Religious factions among both humans and Solari had questioned the implications of such a bond. Military leaders on both sides had worried about instability, about succession, about biological unpredictability. But the fears had slowly dissolved, eroded not by arguments, but by time, by action, by presence. The sight of Seren Thalor seated beside Kael Riven in joint military briefings had become a norm. The sight of Rael running through public squares had become a comfort. The child had reshaped not only policy, but perception. In the central atrium of the Alliance Hall stood a monument carved from fused Solari crystal and Terran basalt. It bore no weapons, no flags, only the likeness of two hands meeting palm to palm over a flowering core, a symbol of the bond that had defied war and rewritten history. Kael's thoughts often returned to the healing pod, its warmth, its hum, the sensation of his identity dissolving into hers, only to reform as something greater. He felt echoes of that moment still in the smallest gestures, the way their thoughts still aligned mid-sentence, the way their movements danced without rehearsal. Some bonds could not be dissolved by time. In recent months, whispers of a new energy signature beneath the northern ranges had begun circulating. Analysts believed it to be another ancient Solari structure, perhaps a vault, perhaps a living archive. Rael had taken interest in the topography before anyone else had mentioned it. He'd drawn sketches in chalk of its shape weeks prior to the scan's confirmation. Kael and Seren had learned not to be surprised. The boy carried more than the best of two species. He carried intuition, shaped by unity. He didn't speak of war, though he studied it. He didn't boast of heritage, though he embodied it. In him the future whispered softly. That night, as the city lights dimmed to allow stargazing rituals to unfold, Kael and Seren stood in the observatory, arms entwined. Rael sat cross-legged by the glass wall, pointing to constellations unnamed by either culture. Beyond the horizon, a transport ship arrived bearing delegates from a system newly invited into the Alliance. There would be more challenges ahead. Other factions, other crises, other cosmic uncertainties. But at the center of it all stood a bond not born of conquest or convenience, but of a promise made in the ruins of a dying city under fire and shadow. A promise that had survived war, reshaped diplomacy, and given rise to a new generation. Not a prophecy fulfilled, a choice honored. And in that quiet moment, as the stars wheeled overhead and the child at their feet traced new paths between them, Kael Riven and Seren Thalor knew their journey was not the end of a story. It was the first chapter of something greater. Across galaxies and generations, some stories are forged, not from grand declarations, but from quiet, unbreakable vows, ones whispered in the ruins, carried in memory, and fulfilled across time. This was the tale of Kael Riven and Seren Thalor. What began as a single act of defiance, a human soldier choosing empathy over orders, cascaded into a transformation of two civilizations. Through war and resonance, through ancient technology and biological convergence, they became not only protectors of Eloria, but harbingers of a new age. Their child Rael stood not just as a symbol of unity, but as proof that love, trust, and shared purpose could alter the destiny of stars. In the end, it wasn't the weapons that changed the course of history. It was the promise kept. If this story moved you, if you felt the heat of plasma fire, the bond of unspoken connection, the breath of destiny just behind every heartbeat, then this is just the beginning. We have countless tales to share across deserts of forgotten planets within the circuitry of sentient machines, and in the dreams of those who dare to defy fate. Leave a comment below. What part hit you the hardest? Was it the rescue, the bond, or the quiet strength of a child between worlds? Subscribe to the channel for more deep emotional, high-concept science fiction stories crafted for long-form immersion. Hit the bell so you don't miss our next voyage beyond the veil of space and deep into the truths that bind us all. Until next time, traveler, keep your promises and look to the stars.